Okay, so I'd now like to introduce you to Ian Watt. Ian Watt is co-founder of Open Data Institute Aberdeen and also co-founder of Code the City Aberdeen. And this is a little bit of a different setup to the conventional kind of academic conference paper or whatever, in that we're going to have a bit more of a conversational format in order to maybe encourage some spontaneous questions, and also then to give you something to think about in terms of Q&A afterwards, if any of you have any questions or comments for Ian. So thank you very much for coming along, Ian. It's a real pleasure to have you.
You're welcome, thank you.
I'd just like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit more about your background, and also maybe to tell us a little bit more about your journey, so to speak. Where did it all begin in relation to open data?
Sure, thank you. I have to say this is probably a bit like the most terrifying job interview in the world, where I've got all these faces watching and asking me questions. So it started for me with open data back in about 2009 or 2010. So I'd become aware of some very good work that was going on with open data. There was a chap called Chris Taggart in England, who's on Twitter as Count Culture, is really worth following. And he had started a website called Openly Local, which has sadly vanished since then. And that was looking at producing data around local authorities across the UK. And where there was open data, which was very, very rare in those days, they used the open data to fuel the Openly Local portal. And where there wasn't, they were scraping data or pulling it in other ways. So I became involved in a conversation with Chris, and that fueled Aberdeen Aberdeen City Council becoming the first local authority in Scotland to produce any open data, which is in the middle of 2010, I think it was. So I was quite intrigued by open data, did a lot of research. This predated, for instance, the ODI, Open Data Institute, being formed by a couple of years. But it seemed to me there was enormous potential for open data to fuel both social and economic innovation and benefits to local communities. So that's how I started out.
Okay, and this was partly to do with your role associated with the local authority itself, right?
Yes, so I was working at the time at Aberdeen City Council, local authority in the northeast of Scotland, for those who are not familiar with it. And all authorities in Scotland are unitary, so we don't have two tiers of government as they do in England and Wales, for instance. And I was running the website and some of their other digital services at the time. So I also, I think, managed at that time their GIS service, so I had access to some of the key things that you would want to do. I could publish quite easily. I had access to a good range of data through the GIS team, and so I had a certain degree of autonomy to just get on and do it, which is often a very powerful thing to do, rather than waiting for permission to be given to do something. So I've always held the view that you should just get on and do stuff, and if somebody takes exception, then ask for forgiveness rather than wait for permission. So.
Yeah, and I guess that's the fuel behind the open data movement, if we can call it a movement, because the whole idea really, I think, is to try and kind of foster a mindset or a worldview where there is a presumption to publish data, particularly data that is intended for public administration, or intended or funded by public money. Is that right?
Yes, I think there is a mindset. I think there is. It's got its roots, I guess, in somewhere around the open source movement as well. So if you look at open source, you're looking at many people being able to contribute. So one of the big arguments I used to get quite regularly when we tried to publish some open data is, we're not sure of the quality of this data. To which my first response was, well, how do you manage to run service X, whether it's roads or planning or whatever, if you're not convinced your data quality? And what do you see the problem in publishing that data openly? Because Linus Torvalds, who was the originator of the Linux operating system, has this concept of many eyes. So you push your code out into the public, and many people will look at it and will spot bugs or problems. And so the view I took was, if we had data and we were reasonably confident that the data had decent quality, we would then push it out there, we would publish it, and we would allow people or encourage people to feed back and say what they perceive to be the problem with that data. That's quite a challenging mindset if you're a risk-averse local government organisation, I would say.
Yeah, and I think, to a certain extent, one can say that that's down to the fact that the amount of data literacy or data awareness in local government, particularly at that time, would have been fairly limited, because of course that would have been a very specialist skill set to have, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So what you would traditionally have is people who had been in careers of a specialist nature. So the person who was running the transport system or running the environmental services had come up through the ranks and had started their career perhaps 20, 30, even 40 years previously, and had a certain mindset in terms of how things should be done. And what we were doing is challenging that and saying, actually, there's a different way of doing things here, which is about more transparency, more openness, more collaboration, more engagement with other services or service users.
So coming back to that notion that, okay, the first step would be many eyes on a set of data or a particular kind of focus on information, and then that would not only help to ensure the quality of data, but also fix some of the problems involved?
So theoretically, that was how we approached it. We wanted to engage with people. We wanted them to look at the data and to decide, or not to decide, but to suggest if there were issues with it, to feed that back so that there would be a kind of virtuous circle. So we come back to us. We would then improve the quality of the data, and we would keep improving it and pushing that back out. At that stage, that far back, there was actually relatively little, because although I was really bought into open data and my colleagues in the team were, actually there wasn't a huge amount of public interest. So part of this is around creating not only the supply but also the demand at the other end as well, and that's something which we continue to work on over a number of years.
So I'm just coming back to that kind of whole notion of how if you're not sure of the quality of your data, how do you run your services? I'm just really intrigued as to some of the answers you might have got as a result of asking that question.
Usually the answer was silence and a slight degree of embarrassment, and then some justification, fairly robust justification about, well, we know we've got the expertise, we've run this service for 20 years, whatever. So.
Yeah, and I completely understand that, actually, because that's kind of the way that things were, and so that kind of goes some way to explain some of the risk aversion and also some of the ways in which local government operates, not behind closed doors, but in a guarded way, in order to ensure that they can run things.
Yeah, and I think that's a natural degree of wishing for privacy. Just let us get on and be the experts and do things, rather than, and this has changed quite a bit, I think, across government and local government now, but significantly, I think the people who are running services saw themselves as the experts, and therefore, being the experts, they would then continue to I guess it's, take it or leave it. So there is no competition in town for using the roads. These are our roads, you're going to use them, whatever. It's not like a retail environment or something where there is a degree of competition, and if a certain retailer isn't getting it right, footfall will go elsewhere. So to that degree, government services are in a bit of a monopoly situation quite often. And I would dare say, I think they've got away with quite a lot for quite a long time in terms of complacency. Thankfully, that mindset I don't think is prevalent now.
Yeah, so there's probably an influx of I would dare say younger people, but not necessarily the case, but people who are open to more accountability and transparency of decision making, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that links to some degree on to the notion of open data in government, because going back to 2008, 9, 10, I forget exactly when, in England and Wales, the UK government, through I think it was a local government association, put an onus on local government to openly publish expenditure data. Anything over £500 had to be published and made public. That never happened in Scotland. And so what we saw is that in England and Wales, there was an open data movement that was started through the transparency agenda, which made it that they had to be able to publish their open data for transparency, and therefore there was a kick-starting happening south of the border, which didn't kick in in Scotland, because it wasn't mandated here.
Okay, yeah, so, and that again makes perfect sense, in relation to the history of governance. We're talking about open data a lot. What I would like to do is just get your take on what open data is, or what it's for, or what it can do, because there seems to be a lot of assumption associated with open data, and also that then leads to a lot of misinformation on what open data can be used for, what its purpose is. So can you give us a little bit more background into your take on open data?
Yeah, so for me it's a reasonably settled question, what is open data? So it's data that has been made available for public reuse. It's got a clear license which states that you can reuse it for any purpose generally. So the OGL, the Open Government License, is very clear in terms of you're allowing commercial and non-commercial use of that data. It's machine readable, it's structured in a way that can be consumed. It doesn't use proprietary formats. It's hopefully got a fixed URI that you can point to and find it and so on. So there is a 5-star model that I think Tim Berners-Lee came up with quite a while ago. And I'll come back to the Scottish Cities Alliance work that we did across the 7 cities. But what we were looking at was publishing at a minimum standard of 3 stars, which is that it's neutral format, it's got a license, it's openly machine readable and so on. When you get beyond the 3 stars, you're into things like linked data and permanent URIs and things. So we set a threshold of 3 stars, which I think is a reasonable aspiration. So it's not locked in a PDF, it's not a proprietary Excel spreadsheet or whatever. So for me, that question of what is open data is reasonably settled, and yet it comes up time and time again. So there is a literacy issue there, I think, with the general public, and even some practitioners or people around government who perhaps still get confused about personal data, whereas open data is non-personal, it's anonymized, it's not attributable to any one individual, so on.
So in terms of things like data protection and GDPR, there's a kind of minimal impact upon open data, you'd say?
I would say definitely. The one thing that needs to be thought about when you're looking at data sets and you're releasing data sets is if that data set relates to an interaction of some kind with a human person, then it may be possible in some way to de-anonymize it. And there have been a few isolated cases of this where perhaps data has been released about journey planning, but one of the people who used that was so remote and lived in a cottage by themselves that it only could be John Smith from that cottage who it related to. So even at that level, there's still some degree of caution is required. But generally speaking, it's data that is not about a person and therefore a natural subject, as they would say, in terms of GDPR.
Okay, that I think is really useful, because again, that's one of the anxieties around open data and leaving things, publicly accessible, publicly viewable, and so on. So I think that's really useful, and I'll probably be using that at some point in the future. So we've talked a little bit about your background. We've talked a little bit about open data and some of the things around open data and how local government has started to pick up on that. Can you tell us a little bit about your observations of the Scottish context in particular of open data? So where have we been? Where are we now? Where are we going?
Yeah, so in some ways it feels like a very long journey, but somebody pointed out to me quite recently that we're actually really at the start of this wave of, transparency and openness and use of open data. And that 8-year period I'm speaking about isn't huge in terms of the history of local government. But during that period, there have been a number of key milestones, I would say. So when I started out, we were pretty much alone in terms of publishing open data. Very quickly, or about the same time, Edinburgh started doing some stuff with Sally Kerr there. And there were a few people started to get their head around it. In about 2013 or 14, Nesta in Scotland, who had previously an active presence in Dundee, I don't know if this is embargoed, but they're going to be having a much more active presence in Scotland again soon. So Nesta came along and said, we have a couple of projects we want to work on, and because Aberdeen and Edinburgh by this point were doing some interesting things, we were chosen to be part of that. So one of them was specifically around open data, and another was, I actually forget the exact nature of the second one, but both featured an element of open data. One was more around the Code for Europe model and so on. And so through that process, we were very fortunate to be able to study in some considerable detail some of the world leaders in terms of open data through the Code for Europe programme. So we visited Helsinki and Amsterdam and Barcelona and Manchester. Doesn't seem to, the same cachet as the others, but we went and we learned, and we were very much engaged with those other leaders in terms of their fields. So I heard you mention the Helsinki Regional InfoShare, for instance, which is doing some fantastic work, and similarly in Amsterdam through their data lab, which is run by the local government in city council there, which is a very open and engaging model for use of data in Amsterdam. So we started to pick up a little bit ahead of steam to push things forward through these national programs supported by Nesta. And then in 2014, the Scottish Government decided it needed an open data strategy, which is a fantastic. So they brought together a panel of people who are engaged in working actively in this. So I was involved, Sally Kerr was involved, and a few other people from around government nationally and locally. And we, over a period of time, came up with an open data strategy for Scotland, which was published in March 2015. I've been quite vocal about my disappointment, I guess you'd say, in terms of it really, in my view, hasn't delivered an awful lot compared to what it could have done by now. And part of that, I think, was that there wasn't very much bite in the strategy, so it was full of nice words. We aim to this, our ambition is to do that, or whatever. But there was no compulsion on anybody to do anything by any date, and I think that was a missed opportunity. So when you look back now 3.5 years later, and look at what has actually happened, I think it's much less than any of us would have guessed would have been the case. So that took us up to 2015, and then subsequent to that, Scottish Cities Alliance, for those who are not familiar with the Scottish Government, Scottish Cities Alliance is a group set up by each of the 7 cities in Scotland, primarily driven by economic development in the regions, or the city regions, and they came up with a broad programme called Scotland's 8th City, the Smart City, which confused an awful lot of people, because everybody thought the Falkirk was trying to get in on the act, but it wasn't. But it was Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, Inverness, Perth. Thanks. How could I forget? Perth's the only one in the room, and I forgot. Apologies for that. I did work out, by the way, that the 7 cities, if you arrange their letters in the right order, which I should have done to start with, gives you Pegasid, which is like one of the meteor showers. So there's a little acronym. So they asked us to look at putting data at the centre of a number of programmes for the 8th City programme. So the 8th City programme is going to cover mobility and transport, waste, environment, a whole 7 or 8 different themes. But at the centre, data was going to be the main thing. And as it transpired, we pushed it to be open data was in the centre of that cluster. So I was chosen or asked to lead that for the 7 cities of Scotland, which was a great opportunity to really try and push the message even further. And we got a certain way with that, and it's continuing. Fraser is here from Perth, who's working on their open data portal. So the open data programme we were putting in place for Scotland had 4 key themes. There was the provision of open data portals for each of the 7 cities to a common high standard. There were the definition of standards for data, so that was around use of metadata, ontologies and taxonomies and all the sort of good stuff around that, but also around publication standards and so on. There was a stream for data visualization, and there was the one which I was most interested in and which Aberdeen was going to lead, which was on the public and internal engagement around the use of open data. So that touched on literacy, it touched on activities around workshops and the use of the data, because I've always had a real difficulty with the notion that city councils would just publish their data and sit back and put their feet up and their arms behind their head and wait for people to come and use it. And actually engaging with the developer community or citizens in a meaningful way that actually got them to use the data was a huge part of that, and the most interesting one for me, because the platforms aren't difficult, really. You know, you want to get them right, but they're not technologically difficult to produce. But actually the value, I think, comes in that engagement piece. And so that was going along until I rashly decided to jump ship and retire last year from the City Council, which was a great opportunity for me, but which had repercussions which I think are still being felt. And I'm not ascribing a great credit to myself, but simply it changed things. So changed personnel, and people have moved on. The coordinator for Dundee moved on. You know, people in Perth have moved aside, and other people have taken over and things. So there is a sort of a period, I think, where things have dipped perhaps over the last year, but I see that they're now advertising for a new data cluster coordinator to manage the programme going forward, which is great. And in the meantime, Aberdeen City Council, when I left, had fallen out of the loop and were, I think, trying to understand what they were going to do as regards open data in amongst all the other organisational changes that were going on. They've now firmly got back on board that, so they've been out, they've procured the same portal, and there's a new programme starting there. So it's really good to see that all 7 cities are now back and pointing in the same direction, albeit at different places and different times and so on.
I'm just wondering, in terms of the strategy itself, what do you see are the headline kind of points where the challenge hasn't been taken up, and where do you think the Scottish Cities Alliance could maybe pick up on some of those things?
So I think there's a there's a lot to be learnt from the Scottish Cities Alliance work, but bear in mind it covers 7 cities and not 32 authorities. So there are 25 other authorities, some of whom are doing work on open data, like Clackmannanshire and North Lanarkshire. But the vast majority aren't doing anything. So I think there's something to be done across local government that pulls everybody up to the same standard and makes it as an expectation that there will be a base level of provision of data, for instance. But of course, Scotland isn't just local authorities, and it's every government agency in Scotland. It's academia, it's health, it's all the sectors. And so what I would like to see is a reinvigoration or a re-energising of the open data strategy for Scotland, which would start to then focus minds on getting high quality, high availability data out there. And I recognise the barriers, and I recognise that all of the public sector is struggling with budgetary constraints, and it's probably not the top of anybody's list of priorities. But I think, given the well-studied, well-researched background to some of this, I think there are loads of case studies that say that the economic and social benefits of actively promoting the use of high quality open data would have sufficient payback to society at large and to the exchequer, potentially through the driving of innovation based on those things. So I would like to see the Scottish Government re-energise or recommit to open data, and to really start to produce something that's got a little bit more teeth, that commits to specific targets, milestones, dates, and so on.
Yeah, I think and some of those sentiments have been replicated in various local government initiatives anyway. So, for example, in City Council Stirling, they have an open data office. So they have an officer, they have various appointments that are associated with that office as part of their kind of digital strategy. So it may be a little bit piecemeal, or it may look a little bit piecemeal, but I think there is a will to do this work, right?
Yeah, I think there are a large number of people who are behind it, who want it to happen. I'm not sure that there is the coordination there. I think there are gaps. So you've got coordination from Scottish Cities Alliance, which is fantastic. You've got 7 cities and a programme that's going to be managed again, which you can say will deliver specific benefits in a business case that were set out. Where I think it falls down is that there isn't national coordination, there isn't a national plan of action, there is no clear. So open data for me doesn't appear to fall into any of the camps of the various pieces of work that are going around digital and data in Scottish Government level. I stand to be corrected on that, but when I wrote the 2 blog posts earlier this year on that, I got no pushback that I can think of from anybody saying I was wrong in the principal points I was making.
So, in other words, then there's room for re-energising the strategy and kind of pushing it through not just the Scottish Cities Alliance, but maybe through some of the other government bodies, some of the other government initiatives that kind of use data or related to data, but aren't kind of at the forefront of that open data strategy.
Yeah, and as I said, I think the hope was that through the Scottish Cities Alliance, the 7 Cities programme, we would be able to demonstrate quality and benefits, and that would act as some sort of beacon or inspiration to, for instance, the other 25 authorities. But yeah, it needs to be bigger and more broad than that as well.
Sure, absolutely. I just want to kind of now move on from those questions and talk a little bit more about some of the local things that you're doing. So, for example, Code the City. So can you tell us a little bit more about Code the City?
Yeah, so Code the City started without a name or a brand back in about 2013, I think it was. And four people came together, so they're now my co-directors of Code the City. We're all male, we're all of a certain age, not by choice, I have to say. We've sought to try and broaden that a little bit without much success recently, but we'd love to, we'd love to attract women. That's not what I'm trying to say, sorry. Perhaps we'll scrub that a bit. So we started in 2013, and we set out to look at public services and how could we make them better. So applying technology for civic or public good. And we did it through a method of broadly based on a hack weekend or hackathon. It evolved very quickly into more being a service design or co-design workshop combined with the hack principles, and always having data and open data at its very centre. So we started that. We adopted the brand Code the City in 2014, and we have engaged with principally the public sector in tackling issues around transport and health and a whole bunch of stuff. It's archaeology most recently, but alcoholism, culture and history and so on. So there's been a wide range. So we just finished our 14th event last week. So we've run about 3 or 4 a year. We'd like to do more with more capacity. And what we do is we bring along service providers, service users hopefully, and look at what are the specific challenges that service users or providers have, and where does technology offer a route to improving that and helping. So some of this, I think James will be aware of this, fits well within the Code for movement. So in the Code for America, Code for Europe and so on, is looking at how do you bolster the capability or capacity of local government particularly, to help them to use new technologies and techniques to improve how services are provided. And so our methodology in a short description is to identify challenges or opportunities, to generate ideas around those to address them, to quickly, using an agile approach over a weekend, to rapidly develop prototype solutions, and to use open source code and open data wherever possible to come up with, by the end of the weekend, a working prototype for each of a number of projects that we've developed. And then to have a sort of show and tell at sort of 5 o'clock on the Sunday afternoon, showing where each has been taken, and an appreciation of what could happen beyond the weekend, because that's really important. We all have fun at the weekend and we all spend a lot of time, we eat some nice sandwiches and drink the occasional beer and whatever. But at the end of the weekend, what happens with those ideas? You know, where do they go, and is there a route forward to make them into real production things, whether it's a new service, whether it's a new product or app or website or whatever. And we've got some good examples of that where some of the Scottish people here might know about Alice, which is a local information system for Scotland, which is a healthcare initiative. And so Alice have been on board with us for a couple of things, and guy there, Douglas Maxwell, has come up and sat in and has put forward challenges in the health sphere. And when we've developed the prototype, he's actually taken that away. He's taken it back to the office. He's got their internal developers to go and build things. So one of them was a really interesting one where it had been identified that people who are using a certain health service didn't always have access to smartphones, or if they had, they didn't all have a data connection or whatever. And Alice are providing high quality signposting to relevant services. And the concept they came up with was actually most people who had the smartphone who used their service, whether they might not have a data service roaming, often had SMS available. And so what we prototyped over the weekend and built, and then they took back and put into production, was an SMS-based signposting service where you could contact Alice with a very simple set of strings, queries, that would then respond with signposting to where to go for that piece of help, whether it was help with drugs or alcohol or poverty or whatever the issues were. And they put that into full production back. So there are a number of examples where we've worked on projects which have been taken. But in my view, not enough. We could do more, and there could be more things actually invested in. But at the moment, we don't have that investment pipeline to take a prototype into full production. Or the person goes back, who's been full of enthusiasm, goes back to City Council X with full of enthusiasm, and of course they can't get the investment to actually make it happen.
I think that's a conversation you and I should have elsewhere, because I think there's some real potential there for either Nestor or Innovate UK or whatever funding for that kind of thing. It seems to me also that model could be replicated in other cities and other areas, and it probably is being done to a certain extent elsewhere.
I'm not sure how much is being done in the same fashion, because it's a methodology that we've iterated over ourselves. But we have, I mean, we've been in Edinburgh, we've run hack weekends or Code the City weekends there. We've done it in Perth, we've done it in the Netherlands in one occasion. And yeah, we're available, and if anybody wants to speak to us about running a weekend anywhere else.
Available for bar mitzvahs and parties.
Exactly, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Excellent. It also occurs to me actually that a lot of that has connection with the open education movement, the open knowledge movement as well. So maybe kind of this is something that we could take up with our colleagues at Wikimedia UK at some point, because I think a lot of that kind of activity is being pushed through things like Wikidata projects and trying to make that project a much more mature approach. Yeah,
I would say that Sarah and I have already had an email exchange following Monday's session where we're starting to explore where we could potentially go with that. What I should say is that Code the City, having been one entity from the start, last year we took the decision to split it into two parts. So you'll see on there are two URLs. One's codethecity.org and one's .co.uk. So in November last year we decided to split into a charity. So the .org is the charity, and that continues to do the principal work of Code the City our social purpose stuff. And we've got aims as a charity which include education and so on in our charitable aims and objectives. We also created the .co.uk, which is Code the City Studio Limited, which essentially will do Code the City methodology events in a kind of corporate environment. So we've done a couple of those recently. So taking out the public sphere and putting it into any other business and saying we can run workshops for you. So that wasn't an advert, it was just to try and explain that we'd sort of bifurcated.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense within the context of what you're saying. As well as being co-founder of Code the City, you're also co-founder of ODI Aberdeen, the node in Aberdeen. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, and do the two sides relate, or do they change? Are they distinctive?
They're not hugely separate, I would have to say. So people may be aware of ODI, the Open Data Institute, so set up by some great people, including Tim Berners-Lee. And they've been in existence since 2012. They developed a node model which allows franchise-type nodes to spring up, to use the brand to deliver the messages, to work on their behalf locally, to run workshops and so on. So there was a really strong alignment between what Code the City were doing and what ODI nodes could be. And so we decided to apply to be a node in Aberdeen. There's a very, very thin dividing line between Code the City and ODI Aberdeen, which is kind of a permeable membrane, I think. So it's the same people, for instance. It's my 3 co-directors and me, or trustees. So we do both things. And sometimes we neglect the ODI Aberdeen a bit of it, I think, because we assume that we're always using that in what we do. And so I think one of the things we've set out in our sort of mission for the next year is to try and increase the defined open data part of what we do, to be more visible as ODI Aberdeen to some degree, although I'm not convinced the branding is a necessary thing, but it's more around the set of values that we espouse in terms of what we do and deliver and so on.
So that kind of clarifies things a little bit, because the two brands are quite different looks like on paper, but essentially it's the same. It's the same operators, if you like.
It is. Yeah.
So now that we've kind of covered lots of aspects of your background, we've covered a lot of aspects of local government and the way that kind of works in relation to open data, and also some of the civic projects and potentially some of the commercial projects that you've been involved with, Ian. So bringing that all together, can we kind of say what an open data infrastructure would look like for Scotland? Can we kind of try and kind of map out a few headlines for what that might look like?
I'm sure we can, yeah. There has been, I think, to some degree, a focus on platforms rather than activity. And so the platforms are starting to fall into place, and there is a growing publication process behind that for local government, at least. I should also credit like the Marine Lab, who have done some exemplary work based in Aberdeen on their open data as well, nationally, for the environment and the marine ecology. But I think that focus on platforms misses an awful lot of what needs to happen. I had, I guess, envisaged that there would be a grassroots movement demanding open data. And we've seen that elsewhere in the UK and beyond. I just don't see it happening enough in Scotland. And I think there's a bit of chicken and egg there, where people become so used to there's very limited publication of open data, so they're not really getting excited about it. But I think that there is to be yet developed an ecosystem around the production, the use, the reuse, the understanding of what the data is, and then the kind of building on top of that a layer of apps, websites, or whatever people choose to do with the data. And I think that ties into citizen journalism and a whole raft of other things. And so where does the stimulus come? Do we always wait for the citizen to push, or do we try to encourage encourage that. So Code the City, we try to encourage all our attendees, for instance, to use open data, to demand open data, to push their own data out there as open data. And as part of the Scottish Cities Alliance programme, the engagement strand of work, one of the things I was really pushing strongly was for some investment from that, which would become essentially seed money to set up local groups to help them get off the ground, to start, demanding and using open data. I don't know where that is in terms of the current thinking and programme. I would also like to see, for instance, academia. So I just finished an MSc a few weeks ago, and there were huge opportunities within the context of that, the teaching, the projects and so on, for the data science students to be using open data as part of their coursework. Actually, very little happened in terms of that. There were little bits, but it tended to be more myself or one of the other students choosing data sets to use for analysis and so on. So I think that engagement with the academic community to say, actually, there's a huge opportunity here to use open data to train students. And those students coming through the courses would then have an awareness of open data and its potentials and its drawbacks and where it doesn't exist, and hopefully become advocates for the open data movement as well. There is education, so there's direct, could we do community learning type training in some fashion to help people to understand that, whether that's around just understand your own community better. So, what do the Scottish Government's data and local government data say about your immediate neighbourhood? Well, if there isn't data there, how do you then go and get that data, and how do you demand it and whatever? And even this morning I was on the train and I was reading an article on the Ferret. I don't know if people know the Ferret. So it's investigative journalism, independent organisation based in Scotland. Really interesting. It's held in high regard internationally. And Ali Tibbett, who's one of the investigative journalists there, had been looking at litter fines. So on the face of it, a very mundane thing. So people who drop litter can get fined for doing so. If they don't pay the fine, what happens? Do they get brought to court? Do they get prosecuted or whatever? And so he'd set off to try and find it. He had to then put in, 32 freedom of information requests around all the local authorities. Some could give him the data, some gave him bits of the data, some gave him nothing, some gave him all. And so he's faced with trying to write a story and do a data visualization map for Scotland of all of this, and trying to piece together all these things and repeatedly chasing up freedom of information requests, appealing to the Information Commissioner when he doesn't get stuff. So Glasgow, I understand, have said, no, you're not getting it, so they've had to go to the Information Commissioner and appeal to get Glasgow's information. And it seems quite ludicrous, because to me that's very basic, simple information. How many fines were there? What the location of those fines were? Have they been paid? It doesn't say Greg dropped his fish and chip wrapper in the street. It's just simple statistical. It's just simple statistical data that should be out there and it should be published. And I guess that takes us to one of the key things I would like to point out is open data shouldn't be a thing per se on its own. It should be part of a process of active data governance and data management, which sees a pipeline that says that at the end of that pipeline, when the data meets these requirements, it's non-personal, whatever, it gets published out to the open data portal. It shouldn't be an add-on which has got to be done by a special open data team and it's got to be chased up, and it only happens when there's FOI requests. It should be a natural progression in terms of a local authority or a government agency just saying, we're looking after our data properly, we're curating it, we're making sure it meets good standards, it's accurate, it's up to date, we're only keeping it for as long. And where it meets those requirements, we're just going to make it available as open data. And so I think part of my appeal would be stop seeing this as a separate thing and just see it as a part of a continuum of data management.
Yeah. Kind of like everyday business as part of the social fabric of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And some things would be more challenging to get to that point because they're perhaps big and complex, and perhaps it's really big data, so you can imagine where you've got 10,000 traffic sensors and they're all logging data, 10 10 times a minute or something, there could be some challenge around how do you make that data available in real time, because it has to be real time to be meaningful. How do you summarize it? How do you produce summaries? When do you publish those? And so on. But other things like, publishing the litter fines and so on should be just a absolute no-brainer.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our session now, but there's been some really, really interesting and insightful comments that you've made there, Ian, with regards to not only your experiences, but in terms of your local government experience, but also in trying to kind of engage people at a kind of more social level. So really interesting, and also the way that you're kind of framing open data not as a kind of technical platform driven thing, but as part of an everyday kind of notion, I think is really important, and something for sure that the Life in Data Network have been kind of exploring those issues for quite some time. So I'm glad we're on the right track. Anyway,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I'd just like to thank Ian for coming along today and speaking. I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking him.
Do any questions if you want as well? Have we got time?
Yeah, I think we've got time for some questions. If anybody has any questions or comments for Ian.
You said earlier that there had been an archaeology project as part of the city. Could you speak a bit more?
Oh, I would love to, yeah. So the archaeology one happened about 2 weeks ago, and the background to it is that in the centre of Aberdeen there's a church called the St Nicholas Kirk, which has got two churches back to back which share a spire in the middle of them. And they took the decision they didn't need two churches anymore because so few people go to church comparatively, that they would move all the two congregations into one half, and they would redevelop the other half of the church as a social space, a business centre, a creative space, or whatever. And so to do this is going back to 2006. They had to do some exploratory archaeology to see which lay beneath the church. And they knew that it was on the site of an older settlement and church there. And so what they did is, over the course of a full year, from January to December, they excavated down about 4 or 5 metres below the basement level of the church. And they went through about 1,000 years of archaeology. So they went back to about, I think, 1100 or 1000 AD. And in the course of that, they found about 900 sets of human remains and all of the other things you would associate with fabrics and jewellery and brooches and possessions and, pieces of wall and whatever. And that was in 2006 to 2007, and they were about to do the next bit, which is called post-excavation analysis, when suddenly the financial bubble burst and all funding for everything that was non-essential seemed to dry up. And so they've struggled to make sense of some of their finds beyond that. So I was having a casual conversation, as these things often happen, with the person who had been the director of the archaeological dig, and she said, we've heard about Code the City, it'd be really amazing if we could do something. So we started to think that through, what it might look like. And so what we did is we looked at the potential for creating a 3D model of the entire church space, and then transposing the written data, which was in JPEGs, Word files, an Access 2 database, some really fun things, Coral photo paint files, and so on. So they were all mixed things, and what we wanted to do is to extract all of the data from that to put each set of skeletons and human remains into a 3D space, so it's an X, Y, and Z depth axis, and then to drop them into a 3D model. So we got quite a way over the weekend to doing that. There were a number of parallel projects working on it, and it was huge fun, and I'll show you some photos of the skeletons later if you want to see them. So.
Sounds great.
Sorry, and all of the data that was created is currently or will be available as open data now as well.
Fab. Archaeological data.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
It was just around what you said about the 8th city. Obviously, there's 32 local authorities, and I think one of the things that can be taken out of this is there's a lot of learnings from this about how to go forward on it. But I also want to completely agree with you that I think it requires the drive of the Scottish Government to actually be more, rather than say our ambition is just to say you will, because that, although we are trying to have open data being a natural output of business as usual following a digital transformation in the council anyway, that really won't have much power behind it until somebody says, by the way, that's one of the outputs you're going to be measured on. And that's what will really drive it forward.
Yeah, I completely agree, Fraser. So we're on the same page as that. It needs to have teeth, and local government departments government departments, local government itself needs to then be held accountable to say how much open data have we produced, how has it been used. So not just throwing everything into a platform and hoping for the best, but actually what have you done with it and how have you engaged with people and what's the product and how do you, so we need some academic rigor, I think, in terms of studying and saying what's that data then being used for as well. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, by all means. James.
Hello. I don't know if this counts as a disagreeing question. So you're talking about sort of the top-down sort of mandating data, but you're also talking about making sure the data is actually used and not just dumped there. And so I guess the question is sort of what have you seen in terms of stimulating demand for data, and what kind of projects have been good for generating more demand for data?
So despite the fact that we started in 2010 and we've now 8 years ahead, I think that there isn't an awful lot of evidence we can put our finger on in Scotland and say what's happened. However, we are in a fortunate position. We can look at other places and other studies. So the oft-quoted Transport for London one is a really useful one, where Transport for London formerly tried to make their own apps for navigating around the transport system in London. They did it really badly, and the Open Data Institute, in fact, as I understand it, suggested that a better use of time would be to make their data available as high-quality, on-demand, API-driven open data, which they did. And so the study that took place actually quite a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago maybe, it discovered that for every £1 that had been spent on creating open data, London as a whole, so measuring the economy of London as a whole, had benefited to the tune of £52. So it's a 52 to 1 ROI, which sounds extraordinary. I mean, from memory, I've got slides back on my laptop, but from memory, HS2 over its entire lifetime is predicted to have a 1.25 ROI. So for every pound, they'll get £1.25, £1.25 back. So 52 to 1 in terms of TfL's open data program is vast compared to that. And it's not alone. So there was an Australian study from one of the states which measured it as about 30 to 1, I think, from memory as well. So people have started to look at that, and they've started to try to measure what the effect of good open data provision and use is. It would be great if part of the engagement program that followed a push on open data actually come up with some sort of study of around how do we measure the effectiveness of this, because if it becomes business as usual and it's just subsumed into general day-to-day operation, which in the way it should do, actually knowing what the effect of that has been is really important as well.
I think that's in terms of equity as well, from what you're saying about those ratios. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean they are, and they're part of research papers. So, and I'll dig out the reference if anybody wants to see them as well. So,
great, thank you. Anybody?
I think you have provided a really fantastic, quite comprehensive overview of, because you have experience working with the Scottish Citizens Alliance in the Aberdeen Council as well, as being really active as driving and kind of mobilizing community groups around data and code. So what is your view? Because as part of our project, as I mentioned, we started kind of wrongly assuming that we needed to tackle first a discussion with the government in order to try to foster a need for data literacy to be embedded within policymaking. And then we realized that had to come bottom up. But as we engage more and more with communities, it seems that it needs to be some sort of combined approach. So what would you advise is kind of the way in which, or whether you think that actually as well, data literacy should be fostered. But what do you think is the approach, the right kind of way of raising that awareness within government?
I think that it's a multi-layered approach. So we've spoken about top down. We've spoken about just build it and they will come. Doesn't tend to work very well. Waiting for the grassroots movement to suddenly mobilize itself is, I think, unrealistic, because people have got lives and they've got jobs and they want to do other things. And therefore, if we just wait for every person in the street or every developer to put down their paid employment to demand, a program of open data. So I think it's going to hit all of these levels. So I think that there needs to be a carrot and stick, is the old expression. We need to be pushing government and local government, or they need to be holding themselves to account on this. We need to be enabling people. So part of your literacy needs to hit the right places. I think I mentioned, not in this interview, but in some of the blog posts I've written around it, I think it needs to tie into secondary school education as well as tertiary education. I think it's beholden to community groups to act as activists. And I think we need to keep hammering away. So it's a big block of stone. And I think we need to be chiseling at every surface of it to reduce it into the right shape. But if we just attack it from one side, it's not going to work. That's okay, you're welcome. All right.
Anybody else?
A case of identifying, you're talking about the sort of return on investment that we experienced in London. Is it then a case of, you've identified the data source that you can make available, you've identified what might be done with it. I'm thinking of an example. We got approached by the NHS relating to a solution that they were building for tracking malaria, so that people have got advanced knowledge, they can check this website, whatever. But if you make the data available, then it's a case of thinking, well, who's actually going to benefit from that data being available? Who would be able to present that data and get marketing exposure from it? So people that do the malaria medicines would benefit from that, so they would be the guys that might fund it. The travel companies, etc., might get some additional web traffic from that. So it might be something like that drives it. It's actually taking, well, what data have we actually got, who's going to benefit from it, and and getting that three-way partnership. The consumer, the guys marketing perspective that could benefit from it, and then the data owners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, where the model you're proposing perhaps shows a route to getting some additional funding in to move things on perhaps more quickly than they would otherwise. And that's certainly one it's, I think, really worth looking at. The other conversation I had through in the kitchen with other people was around expecting the person in the street to make sense of raw data, no matter how good it is relatively unrealistic. We use the analogy when we're speaking about oil. So the person in the street needs oil to drive their car, or to make plastic, or to heat their house. But giving them oil as such, a bucket of oil, and go, here you go and do something with that, is not going to, or crude oil, is not going to help. And I think Jack and I, when we were speaking, Jack was saying, well, it's more around the kind of analogy of water in some ways, where it's a raw resource, and actually some companies will make use of it by developing, the taps to put in your house to make the water flow or whatever. So I think there are a number of different angles of attack, and if we can accelerate some of them through, for instance, partnerships with private sector, I don't have a problem with that if the outcome is that there's openly licensed data that anybody can use, and not just sold to the private sector for that, which kind of defeats the open data agenda completely.